Hey, it's Martin from MWSculpts here. We have a big problem. A 4-foot square wargaming board with no terrain at all. We need to produce terrain in a repeatable, cost-effective way so we can fill the board and make it look cool. So, let's get started. First off, we need to research the look and feel we are going for with our terrain. Once we have a collection of references, it's off to Blender to make some terrain bits. We need to create elements that we can mold and cast easily to produce a variety of terrain pieces for the board. Check out the description for all the tools and resources I'm using for this build. So let's start creating some terrain bits to print out. Bricks are a quick, straightforward way of creating our first pattern. To give the bricks a little more interest, try the scrape tool on the corners and edges, but try to keep it varied to make things look more natural. We can duplicate and rotate the bricks to keep things interesting, and also scale them to add variety. As I am going for older looking buildings, rotating the bricks on the Z and X axis makes them look a bit rougher. Adding a thin cube to the back of the brick panels so we can visualize them on a wall better. Draw Sharp is great for cutting into the bricks to add cracks, then using pinch at the end gives it a nice finish. Our bricks are looking a little flat, so we can come in with clay strips and build up areas. Then use the scrape tool to flatten them slightly back down. Remeshing the bricks after joining them together, we can use the line project tool to flatten out the back. Adding a cube, then going into edit mode with tab, ensure you're using vertex select mode with the 1 key and hit E to extrude vertices into a shape roughly matching the brick group. We can then extrude this out to join with the bricks to hold them all together when printed. Using the array modifier with 2 different size bricks will create the cornerstone brick pattern. Then cutting away at the edge at a 45-degree angle will allow 2 to fit together nicely. Let's move on to wood now. Creating a single wood plank with good grain definition is key here. So let's use vertices again with the skin modifier this time to produce the grain shapes. Use Ctrl and A to scale the grain skin. Wood grain tends to flow in a similar direction with occasional bends. Let's add in some shorter ones too to break up the rhythm. We can then use the Bool tool add-on to cut these shapes away from our plank to create the grain. Duplicating this plank a few times and placing an elongated cube in the middle will be our wooden beam shape. This can be used throughout the structure of our building. Creating the roof tile pattern will be slightly more involved. My first attempt at this was box modeling a single tile, then using the array modifier a couple of times to create a grid. However, this looked a bit rigid and unrealistic. This sounds like a job for geometry nodes. Using this tool, we can create a grid of roof tiles with varying scale and rotation to give this the look we need. Starting with a plane, we can use the subdivide mesh node to break this up into multiple points. Then adding instance on points and object info nodes to bring in the object info. I'm using a flagstone model for now until we get the settings right. Between the object info and instance on points, I'm adding a scale instances node to get these to the size we want. Then, to get our varied rotation, we need rotate instances, random value, and combine XYZ nodes. Then, when plugged into the rotation input here, we will get each node with a slight randomized rotation. Now we have an idea of what we need to do. I've switched out the object info for our tile model. We can use the same nodes to give the scale variation too. To finish off our tile effect, let's make a few variations on our original tile model. Placing these in a collection, then replacing the object info node with the collection info node will enable us to randomly disperse these variations over the points. The realize instance nodes will allow us to convert this object into a mesh, then prepare for 3D printing. Moving on now to door and window frames. These will be great shapes to outline the key openings of the building. Just like with the bricks earlier, we can use cubes and the scrape tool to shape the stones surrounding these openings. Keep in mind the depth of these stones when up against the wall. I'm making the details have a depth from 1 to 2 millimeters, so they can print out clearly and will mold and cast well. The measure tool in object mode is a great way to check these depths. From a thin cylinder, add the array modifier, then duplicate and flip this object to create a mesh for some small windows. Another cool detail is a dormer. I didn't know this was called a dormer until I looked it up. We can reuse the roof tile object here to create the roof of this window. Then make a copy of our little window to place on the front. The wood pattern we created earlier can be tiled onto the front and sides using the array modifier. All these terrain bits now need to be prepared and exported for 3D printing. For a full breakdown of how I do this, check out my 3D printing with Blender tutorial in the description. Something I've started doing with bigger projects is creating a cube and setting the scale to the size of your printer's build volume. Then in object properties, displaying this as a wire. This way you can place the objects into the volume, orient and scale them right in Blender. I needed to do 2 build plates worth of prints for this project, as I duplicated some of the objects, like the wooden planks, to allow us to cast at a quicker rate. It's off to Lychee to support and slice our models ready for the printer. Once printed, they come off a little bit like this. We need to scrape them off the build plate, remove the supports with some hot water, and clean them using IPA. I use a soft brush to ensure they get cleaned in the gaps too. I created a little curing chamber using an old bin with the bottom cut out and lined it with tinfoil, then placed a UV lamp on top. With our bits off the printer, we need to prepare them for moulding. Using fine grit sandpaper, this one is 320 grit. I'm sanding away the back flat. Then, with some warm water and dish soap, cleaning the parts with a soft brush and setting them on a microfiber cloth to dry. Some of the thinner parts have become warped after the curing process. To flatten these out again, boil some water and place them in for a few seconds. Then hold the part down on a flat surface until it has cooled to get it to set in the desired position. We will need to create several moulds for this project of varying sizes. A dynamic way to create mould cases is using standard Lego bricks. With these, you can build any size case to suit your needs. To fix the parts down, I'm going to use a hot glue gun. It's a quick, easy way to temporarily fix them to the base. I'm using a 1mm sheet of plasticard here. Once in place, I'm going to brush on a homemade mould release. This consists of petroleum jelly and Sansador, or white spirit. I struggle with the smell of white spirit, so Sansador is just a low odour version. The spirits dissolve the petroleum jelly to make it brush on easier. Once you have the parts and Lego case in place, hot glue the case to the plasticard just to be sure that things don't shift around when we pour the silicone. It's silicone time! I'm using this standard silicone from DWR Plastics. Check out the description for a full list of tools used in this project. You need a tin cure silicone to ensure it works with resin printed objects. It comes in 2 parts, the silicone and a smaller bottle called the catalyst. Grab a disposable cup and a weighing scale, place the empty cup on the scale. Once the weight is decided, I'm hitting the tare button to set the scale to 0. Then pour in the silicone. This bit has always been a bit fiddly for me, but so far I've found that using a spoon and scraping it off has been the most controlled approach. Once the silicone is weighed, take a note of the value, then divide by 100 and times by 3. This is 3% of the silicone's weight, and it's about how much catalyst we will need to mix in. Hit the tare button again on the scales. Give the bottle a good shake and use a pipette to dispense. Don't try to pour this stuff, as I've learnt the hard way. You have far less control and it gets all over the bottle. Give the 2 parts a good mix. In my experience, with this silicone, you don't need to worry about introducing bubbles, as we will pour it in a way shortly that will remove most of them. Pinching the cup and starting off the pour, tilt the cup so that you get as thin a stream as possible. I'm standing up here, once I get going, to give the stream a lot of distance. Pouring in this way will remove most of the air in the mixture. Also, pouring slowly will give the silicone less chance to trap air in and around the 3D print. After leaving the mold to set for several hours, let's tear off the Lego and see what we have. You might find some of the parts stick inside the silicone. Just pull those out. I'm using a newish hobby knife to trim off the flash of the mold to tidy things up. Now it's time to recreate our 3D parts using plaster. I'm using Mold Master Stonecast powder here. You can just eyeball the mix of water and powder and mix until you get a milk-like consistency. I've added a drop of flow aid to the water, which will remove the surface tension of the water and allow the plaster to have less bubbles and flow better into the tiny details of our molds. You could also use dish soap if you don't have any flow aid. Using a soft brush, I'm pulling out the mixture and painting into the molds. This also reduces the chances of bubbles and helps the mold get filled correctly. After around half an hour, the plaster parts are ready to pop out. As most of these objects are pretty thin, it's been hit and miss whether they come out in one piece, especially the doors and window frames. Luckily, with the ruined style we are going for, the broken parts can be used to our advantage. Now we have a collection of plaster parts, it's time to start the build. I'm using some 5mm foam core here. I have cut out a thin strip and cut away the door and window openings. Also, if you score the foam core but don't cut all the way through, it can act as a hinge to keep our walls together. Starting with the door frame, we can use the trusty hot glue gun to begin placing these plaster parts. Drawing around the walls with a pencil, we can cut out a base. This material is not ideal as a base, as when it gets too wet it can warp, but I think we'll get away with it for this piece. Holding the hobby knife at an angle, we can taper the base along the edge to create a slope. Hot glue the walls to the base now, and we can start adding more plaster parts. We can use the knife to roughly cut away areas of the walls to make things look a bit more destructive. Roughly measuring out the first floor with a pencil, we can cut away a jagged edge. We will be placing our wooden planks on here. We can add the cornerstones and some of the little windows on the walls to give things more detail. Once the first floor is stuck down, cut out a couple of pieces to form the roof. We can get the dormer stuck on the roof now. Taking our grid of tiles, I'm breaking it up into several pieces. We can then place these onto the roof randomly to create a great rickety roof texture. I made some little supporting blocks for the first floor, just to add a little more detail and realism to the building. Be sure to check out the description to download all the models created for this project for free on my Gumroad. Using the knife, we can cut the wooden beams to fit different areas of the building. Time to lay some flooring on the first floor. I've gone for a brick-like pattern initially, and then a bit more chaotic on the edges. Similar to the roof tiles, we can break up our brick panel and randomly place them on the building. It's surprising, but you only need a few patches to create the impression needed. There's a couple of extra details I printed from Thingiverse, such as a chest and a barrel. You can find links to those in the description. Some of the wood flooring is broken off and has fallen to the floor below. This is where more of our broken plaster bits can come in handy. Now the building and plaster parts are in place, things are looking a bit clunky. We need to fill out the gaps to merge everything together. I'm using an all-purpose filler from Tesco here in the UK, but anything similar will do the job. Using an old brush to paint where the plaster meets the foam core, hiding any visible hot glue as we go. To avoid the filler getting a bit clumpy around the edges, have some water handy to thin out the filler if needed. We only really want it thick in the gaps. Once we have filled out the gaps, allow things to dry. Then I'm adding some final texture using this grey pumice from Vallejo. I've had this pot for ages now, and once I run out, I would just use a mix of PVA and bicarb rather than buy more. You could use fine sand to get the same effect too. Let's apply the base coat now, using a mixture of Mod Podge and black craft paint from the works here in the UK. Using a house brush, I'm liberally applying the mix. This will give us a good flat base coat to work off while also strengthening the model. Don't be afraid to water this mixture down if it's too thick, as you could obscure details. Once the base coat is dry, we can move on to painting. I'm using this brown craft paint for the wooden areas first. Then a neutral grey for the stones. I'm being careful to keep our shadows nice and dark while only painting the raised up areas the flat colour. The brown is looking a bit striking, so I'm mixing a little of the black with the brown to tone the value down. Using a smaller brush, I'm adding some white to the tops of the bricks to give them more depth. Moving on to dry brushing, I'm using an old makeup brush and a paper towel. Starting with a neutral grey, I'm wiping most of the paint off on the paper towel before I begin dry brushing the building, focusing mainly on the brickwork. Then I'm using the white with very little paint on the brush and going over the whole building. This will really make the details pop and leave all the recesses our original black colour, creating some nice contrast. Considering most of our colour here is a reddy brown, some green elements would be a great complement to this scheme. I have some old green flock here which I'm going to mix with PVA glue. We can paint this mixture into random areas of the building to give it that extra layer of realism and depth, while also complementing the browns. And there we go, a ruined Mordheim style building which we can easily reproduce in future builds. Thanks for checking out the video, and I hope you picked up some ideas for embarking on your own terrain building adventure. The sky really is the limit when it comes to moulding and casting plaster parts like this. Don't forget you can grab all the models used in this build from my Gumroad, along with other free miniatures and Blender sculpting resources. Lately, I had a go at creating my own Mordheim Archer character in Blender to fill out my squad. If you're interested, I'll put up a link to that at the end of the video. Thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon, and if you want to join in, follow the link here. See you all in the next one.